Enjoy tonight's story, which is Squashed Romances. From a place called Squashed Books. Why Squashed Books? Well, we're drawing tonight on the amazing editing work of Mr. Glyn Hughes of Derbyshire, England. As Mr. Hughes points out, there's a certain set of books which you're just supposed to know about, at least if you live in the West and want people to call you, educated. Many of these books look far too old, long, or boring, but still the polite world expects its members to be at least on nodding terms with Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Darcy, Starbuck, Mr. Toad, Mr. Scrooge, Leopold Bloom, Raskolnikov, Einstein and Enkidu, and besides. It's a lot of fun to be able to explore these timeless works in a quick and exciting way. And once you get a taste of a particular book, you may be spared ever picking it up again if you hate it. Or you may just want to dive in and read the original book cover to cover. And so tonight, and next week, in honor of February being the month of love, we're going to jump right into 4 classic romance novels. 2 tonight and 2 more next week. Now, earlier this week, we sent out a poll to find out what kind of romance stories you all would enjoy hearing, and the results were 8% passionate, 15% tragic, 46% happy ending, and 31% complicated, and 1 write-in for gothic. I wonder who that was. And 1 write-in specifically for Persuasion by Jane Austen. So let's see if your storyteller can actually pull this off. We're aiming for 1 hour total here, but asking you to allow up till 8:30 tonight in case we run over. We will start off with The Castle of Otranto. Nice lead in, Rolo, because how many of you heard of The Castle of Otranto, 1764 novel by Horace Walpole? It's generally regarded as the first Gothic novel, influencing Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and even Poe, as well as other Gothic-style authors to follow, including the grande dame of romance novels, Miss Jane Austen. So, let's see, Manfred. Manfred is the ruler of Otranto. He is impatiently waiting for the marriage between his sickly son Conrad and the Princess Isabella. His impatience is related to an ancient prophecy. The castle and the lordship of Otranto should pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it, whatever that means. However, on the day of the wedding, Conrad is mysteriously crushed to death by a giant helmet falling from the sky. Almost Monty Python-esque here, or perhaps a Georgia Lass moment. By the way, in this story, a helmet is also called a casque. That's with a Q-U-E, not an A-S-K, because that would be a barrel, which is Amontillado. Anyway, realizing his only heir is dead and unable to produce more sons with his own wife, Hippolyta, Manfred decides to continue his line by marrying his son's fiancée, Isabella, while she still stands staring at her squished husband-not-to-be. With the help of Theodore, a peasant, and the ghost of Manfred's grandfather, presently haunting a large painting and a giant disembodied leg in armor, Isabella escapes the castle through a secret underground passageway to seek sanctuary under the protection of Father Jerome. Having recognized Theodore's resemblance to Otranto's oh-so-handsome past hero and ruler Alfonso, more than one fair damsel in this story falls in love with our hero Theodore, as the battle to determine a proper bloodline for ruling this empire ensues. So not really necessary to give you an intro, but it kind of helps. Anyway, complicated? Check. Tragic? Check. Passionate? Check. Gothic? Check. And happy ending? Well, let's get on to the story and see, shall we? Oh, by the way, if you would like to read along with the story tonight, it is at Pip Flap. There. And if anybody IMs me directly in Kitely, I won't see you because I've got that turned off because we're streaming that to YouTube. If you'd like to read the full version of this book, or indeed any of our books this week, you can find them at the romance section of the brand new Falling Water B&B library in Kitely, where you can sit in beautiful surroundings, as many of you are right now, or in front of a roaring fire and listen to music to read romance by on the free romance radio. You can dance poolside with an on-demand romantic NPC dance partner of your very own. You can even snuggle down for a nap, read with a friend, or an NPC companion of your choosing. In fact, I hear Jean-Luc Picard is even available there for a back rub while you read your favorite Jane Austen. Or, of course, you can also just download the book and scurry along your way. And yes, there's lots of girls there also. Now, on to the Castle of Otranto. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Oh, wait, wrong book. Let's try that again. The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. Chapter 1, The Helmet. Manfred, Prince of Otranto, had contracted a marriage for his son Conrad with the Marquis of Vicenza's daughter Isabella. Young Conrad's birthday was fixed for his espousal, and Manfred's impatience for this ceremonial was marked by everyone. His tenants and subjects attributed this haste to the prince's dread of seeing accomplished an ancient prophecy that the castle and lordship of Otranto should pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. Now, it was difficult to make any sense of this prophecy, yet this mystery did not make the populace adhere the less to their opinions. On the wedding day, when the company was assembled in the chapel of the castle, Conrad himself was missing. Now Dagmar shows up. After I have to do the whole never, ever, ever obligation thing all by myself, now Dagmar shows up. Welcome, Dagmar. There we go. Got it. On the wedding day, when the company was assembled in the chapel of the castle, Conrad himself was missing. Manfred, impatient of the least delay, sent an attendant to summon the young prince. In less than a minute, the attendant came back breathless and frantic manner, foaming at the mouth. At last, after repeated questions, he cried out, "Oh, the helmet! The helmet! The helmet!" Manfred, most of the company ran out in the court, and from whence was heard a confused noise of shrieks and horrors and surprise. What a sight for a father's eyes! Manfred beheld his child dashed to pieces, squished, as it were, and almost buried under an enormous helmet, 100 times more larger than any casque ever made for a human being, and shaded with a proportionable quantity of black feathers. Here you go, Rollo. Gooey guts. Now the horror of the spectacle and the tremendous phenomenon before him took away the prince's speech. Yet his silence lasted longer than even grief could occasion, and when he spoke it was observed that his first words were, "Take care of the Lady Isabella." Manfred then touched and examined the fatal casque. Remember, that's a helmet. And inquired whether any man knew from whence such a thing could have come. Nobody could give him the least information. At length, however, a young peasant from a neighboring village observed that the miraculous helmet was exactly like that on the figure in black marble of Alfonso the Good, one of the former princes in the church of St. Nicholas. "Me villain!" cried Manfred in a tempest of rage. "How darest thou utter such treason?" Now at this moment there came news from the church that the helmet was missing from Alfonso's statue. Manfred rushed frantically on the young peasant, crying, "Sorcerer! 'Tis thou hast done this!" Coming to himself, he gravely declared that the young man was a necromancer, and ordered that he should be kept prisoner under the very helmet itself till the church should take cognizance of this affair. Now Conrad's mother, the Princess Hippolyta, had been carried fainting to her apartments, accompanied by her daughter Matilda, who smothered her own grief in order to assist her afflicted parent, and by Isabella. To his wife and daughter, Manfred that day paid no attention. But as the ladies sat together sorrowing at night, a servant of Manfred's arrived and told Isabella that his lord demanded to speak with her. "I sent for you on a matter of great moment," said he. "Isabella, the line of Manfred calls for numerous supports, and since I cannot give you my son, I offer you myself." "Oh, heavens!" cried Isabella. "You, my lord, the husband of the virtuous and tender Hippolyta." "Name not that woman to me," said Manfred imperiously of his wife. "I shall divorce her. My fate depends on having sons." He seized the hand of Isabella, who shrieked and started from him, At that instant, the portrait of his grandfather, which hung in the apartment, uttered a deep sigh and descended from its panel on the wall. Manfred, in his distraction, released Isabella, who had not seen the portrait's movement, and who made towards the door. The spectre marched sedately, but dejectedly, into a chamber on the right hand. Manfred would have followed, but the door was clapped to with violence, nor could he with all his force reopen it. As Isabella took flight, she recollected a subterraneous passage which led from the vaults of the castle to the church of St. Nicholas. She determined, if no other means of deliverance were offered, to shut herself up forever among the holy virgins whose convent was contiguous to the cathedral. In this resolution she seized a lamp that burned at the foot of the staircase and hurried towards that secret passage. Now the lower part of the castle was hollowed into several intricate cloisters. It was not easy for one under so much anxiety to find the door that opened into the cavern. When in that long labyrinth of darkness a gust of wind extinguished her lamp, words cannot paint the horror of her situation. It gave her a momentary relief to perceive a ray of moonshine gleam from the roof of the vaults, which seemed to be fallen in. But as she advanced, she discerned a human form standing close against the wall. She shrieked, believing it to be the ghost of Conrad. But the figure asked her in a submissive voice not to be alarmed. "Sir, whoever you are, assist me to escape from this fatal castle." "Alas," said the stranger, "what can I do to assist you?" "Oh," said Isabella, "help me but to find the trap-door that is hereabout. It is the greatest service you can do me, sir." With a little searching, they found the trap-door. The stranger lifted it, and Isabella descended to some stone steps below. The stranger was about to follow when the voice of Manfred was heard in the distance. Make haste, or we are ruined!" Isabella cried out, but the door slipped out of his hands and fell with a crash. Instantly Manfred, who had heard the noise, hastened up, accompanied by his servants with torches. "It must be Isabella, escaping by the subterraneous passage," he cried. But what was his astonishment when the light discovered to him the young peasant whom he had thought confined under the helmet. "Traitor, villain, sorcerer, how camest thou here?" said Manfred. "I am no traitor," replied the young man. "That is how I came here." He pointed upwards, and Manfred perceived that one of the cheeks of the cask had broken through the pavement of the court as his servants had let it fall over the peasant and had made a gap through which the young man had escaped. "Ah, and what was that noise which I just heard, then?" asked Manfred. "Providence led me to the trap-door," answered the peasant, "but I let it fall." Manfred removed him to confinement in the castle and continued in his vain search for Isabella. Chapter 2. Father Jerome. On the following morning, Manfred went to Hippolyta's apartment to inquire if she knew aught of Isabella. While he was questioning her, word was brought that Father Jerome demanded to speak with him. Manfred ordered him to be admitted. "Is this your business with me or the princess?" asked Manfred. "Why, with both, your holiness, the Lady Isabella." "What of her?" interrupted Manfred. "The Lady Isabella is at Nicholas' altar," replied Jerome. "That is no business of Hippolyta's," said Manfred with confusion. "Let us retire to my chamber." "No, my lord," Jerome said firmly. "My commission is to both, and in the presence of both I shall deliver it. But first I must interrogate the princess, whether she is acquainted with the cause of the Lady Isabella's flight." Not on my soul," said Hippolyta. "Father," interrupted Manfred, "I am the sovereign here, and will allow no meddling priest to interfere with my domestic affairs." "My lord, I know my duty, and I am the minister of a mightier prince than Manfred." Manfred trembled with rage and shame, but Hippolyta intervened. "Holy father, it is my duty to hear nothing that it pleases not my lord I should hear. Attend the prince to his chamber, I will retire to my oratory." "An excellent woman," said Friar. "My lord, I attend your pleasure." As soon as they had entered the prince's apartments, Manfred began. "I perceive that Isabella has acquainted you with my purpose, Father Jerome? Now hear my resolve. Urgent reasons of state demand that I should have a son. It is in vain to expect an heir from Hippolyta.
I have made choice of Isabella. You must bring her back to me.
Prince, said Jerome, the injuries of the virtuous Hippolyta have mounted to the throne of pity. By me thou art reprimanded for thy intention of repudiating her. By me thou art warned not to pursue the wicked designs on Isabella.
Father, you mistake me, said the prince. You know not the bitterest of my pangs. I have had the scruples on the legality of our union. Hippolyta is related to me, yes, related to me in the 4th degree. It is true we had a dispensation, but I have been informed that she had been contracted to another. Ease my conscience of this burden, Father Jerome, by dissolving our marriage.
For some time the holy man remained absorbed in this thought. At length, conceiving some hopes from delay, he professed to be struck with the prince's scruples. Manfred was overjoyed at this apparent change.
Good, good. Now, since we now understand one another, resumed the prince, I expect that you will satisfy me on one point. Who is the youth that I found in the vault? He must have been privy to Isabella's flight. Is he her lover?
The friar conceived it might not be amiss to sow the seeds of jealousy in Manfred's mind, so that he might be prejudiced against Isabella, or have his attention diverted to a wrong scent. With this unhappy policy, Father Jerome answered in a manner to confirm Manfred's fears.
Aye, I will fathom to the bottom of this intrigue, cried Manfred in a rage, and quitting Jerome abruptly, he hastened to the great hall and ordered the prison to be brought before him. The young man, finding that his share in Isabella's flight had been discovered, boldly told the truth of his adventure in the vault. On this silly girl's report, said Manfred, thou didst hazard my displeasure?
I fear no man's displeasure, said the peasant, when a woman in distress puts herself under my protection. Now Matilda was passing through a latticed gallery at the upper end of the hall, when her attention was drawn to the prisoner. The gallantry of his last reply interested her in his favour. His person was noble, handsome, and commanding, but his countenance soon engrossed her whole care.
My heavens, said Matilda to herself softly, is he not the exact resemblance of Alfonso's picture? Take him to the courtyard and sever his head from his body, was the sentence of Manfred.
Matilda fainted. Father Jerome, horrified at the catastrophe his imprudence had occasioned, begged for the prisoner's life, but the undaunted youth received sentence with courage and resignation. In the courtyard he unbuttoned his collar and knelt down to his prayers. As he stooped, his shirt slipped down below his shoulder and disclosed the mark of a bloody arrow.
Gracious heavens,
cried out Father Jerome.
It is my child. It is my Theodore. What may this mean? How can it be thy son? Cried Manfred. Spare him, good prince. He is my lawful son. He was born to me when I was the Count of Falconara. Sicily can boast of few houses more ancient. Is it possible my lord can refuse a father of the life of his long-lost child? Cried out Father Jerome. Return to thy convent, answered Manfred after a pause. Conduct the princess whither. Obey in me what else thou knowest, and I promise the life of thy son, Father Jerome.
Rather let me die 1,000 deaths, cried out Theodore. And ere Manfred could reply, a brazen trumpet, which hung without the gate of the castle, was suddenly sounded. Chapter 3. The Knight of the Sword. Now it was announced that a herald sought to speak with Manfred, who ordered him to be admitted.
I came, said the herald, from the renowned and invincible knight of the gigantic sabre. In the name of his lord Frederick, Marquis of Vicenza, he demands the Lady Isabella, daughter of that prince whom thou hast barely got into thy power, and he requires thee to resign the principality of Otranto, which thou hast usurped from the said Lord Frederick and the nearest blood to the last rightful Lord Alfonso the Good. If thou dost not instantly comply with these just demands, he defies thee to single combat to the last extremity.
Injurious as the challenge was, Manfred reflected that it was not his interest to provoke the Marquis. He knew how well-founded the claim of Frederick was. Frederick's ancestors had assumed the style of princes of Otranto, but Manfred's family had been too powerful for the house of Vicenza to dispossess them. Frederick had taken the cross and gone to the Holy Land, where he was wounded, made prisoner, and reported to be dead. Manfred had bribed Isabella's guardians to deliver her up to him as a bride for Conrad, hoping to unite the claims of the two houses. How are we doing for complicated so far? Pretty good?
Harold,
said Manfred.
tell thy master that ere we liquidate our differences with the sword, I would hold converse with him. Bid him welcome to the castle.
In a few minutes the cavalcade arrived. Pages and trumpeters were followed by foot guards. Then came knights with their squires, then 100 gentlemen bearing an enormous sword, seeming to faint under its weight. Then the knight himself in complete armour, his face entirely concealed by his visor. As the knight entered, the plumes on the enchanted helmet in the courtyard were tempestuously agitated and nodded thrice. The knight gazed on the casque, dismounted, and kneeling down, seemed to pray inwardly for some minutes. Manfred, during the feast that followed, discoursed to his guests of his claim to Otranto through the will of Alfonso, bequeathing his estate to Don Ricardo, Manfred's grandfather, in consideration of faithful services, and he suddenly suggested his plan of uniting the houses by divorcing his wife Hippolyta and marrying the fair Isabella. But the knight and his companions would not reveal their countenances, and although they occasionally made gestures of dissent, they hardly ever spoke. Manfred's discourse was interrupted by the news that Isabella had fled from the convent. The knight was not less disturbed at this than Manfred himself, and rushing to the door, summoned his attendants to search for them. Manfred also gave orders that she should be found, hoping to secure her for himself and to prevent her from falling into the hands of the strangers. When the company had quitted the castle, Matilda bethought herself of Theodore. Theodore, who had been placed hastily in confinement, his guards had been by accident included in the general order that had been given by Manfred for the pursuit of Isabella, and therefore he stood unguarded, and Matilda stole to the prison and unbolted the prison door.
"Fly,"
Matilda cried out.
"The doors of thy prison are open, O Theodore. May the angels of heaven direct thy course."
"And thou art surely one of these angels," said the enraptured Theodore.
"But dost thou not neglect thine own safety in setting me free?" "Nay, I am Manfred's daughter. No dangers await me."
"Is it possible? Can Manfred's blood feel holy pity?"
"Hasten, hasten, I tremble to see thee abide here."
Matilda took him to the armory and equipped him with a complete suit.
"Yonder behind that forest," she said, "is a chain of rocks, hollowed into caverns that reach the sea-coast. Lie concealed there until thou canst make signs to some vessel to take thee off."
Theodore then flung himself at Matilda's feet, kissed her hand, vowed to get himself knighted, and entreated her permission to swear himself her knight. But Matilda bade him hasten away, and thus made an end of an interview in which both had tasted, for the first time, the passion of love. When Theodore had reached the caves and was roving amongst them, he heard steps retreating before him and an imperfect rustling sound. He gave pursuit and caught a breathless woman who besought him not to deliver up to Manfred.
"No, Lady Isabella, I have once already delivered thee from his tyranny." "Art thou the generous unknown whom I met in the vault, then?"
"Surely, thou art my guardian angel." A cry was heard.
"Isabella! What ho, Isabella!"
The knight of the sword approached, and Theodore bade him advance at his peril. Each took the other for an emissary of Manfred. They rushed upon each other, and after a furious combat, the knight was wounded and disarmed. Some of Manfred's domestics running up informed Theodore that the knight was an enemy of Manfred, and Theodore, touched by his compunction, helped to staunch his wounds. When the knight recovered his speech, he asked faintly for Isabella. Theodore flew to her, told her of his mistake, brought her to the knight, who seemed to be dying now.
"Isabella,"
said the knight, struggling for utterances.
"Isabella, thou seest before thee thy father." "Oh, amazement! Horror!"
cried Isabella.
"My father!" "Yes, I am Frederick, thy father. I came to deliver thee, Isabella. May not be."
Here he could say no more, and he was carried back to the castle, whither Isabella accompanied him, Theodore vowing to protect her from Manfred. The prophecy fulfilled. It was found by the surgeons that none of Frederick's wounds were mortal, and when he was recovering, he informed Hippolyta of his story. While a prisoner with the infidels, he had dreamed that his daughter was in danger of the dreadful misfortunes, and that if he repaired to a wood near Joppa, he could learn more. On being ransomed, he instantly set out for the wood, and where he found a cave, found in a cave a hermit on the point of death, who with his last words bade him dig under the 7th tree on the left of the cave. When Frederick and his attendants dug according to the directions, they found an enormous sabre, aye, the very weapon that was now in the court of the castle, with these lines written upon the blade: "Where a casque that suits this sword is found, with perils is thy daughter compassed round. Alfonso's blood alone can save the maid, and quiet a long and restless prince's shade." On hearing on his return that Isabella was at Otranto in the hands of Manfred, Frederick had travelled thither, and on arriving had beheld the miraculous casque that fulfilled the lines on the sword blade. Manfred, on entering the castle after the search, beheld Theodore in his armour. He started in agony of terror and amazement.
"Ha! Ha! Thou dreadful spectre, what art thou?" "My dearest lord," said Hippolyta, clasping him in her arms, "what is it that you see?"
"Why, is it not Alfonso? Dost thou not see him?"
"Oh, this, my lord," said Hippolyta, "is Theodore."
"Theodore?"
said Manfred, striking his head.
"But how come he here?"
"I believe,"
answered Hippolyta,
"he went in search of Isabella."
"Isabella! Isabella! Isabella!"
cried Manfred, relapsing into jealous rage.
"Has this youth been brought into my castle to insult me, then?"
"My lord," said Theodore, "is it insolence to surrender myself thus to your highness's pleasures? Behold my bosom!" he continued, laying his sword at Manfred's feet. "Strike, my lord, if you suspect that a disloyal thought is lodged there." Even Manfred was touched by these words.
"Rise, rise, thy life is not my present purpose."
Manfred now devised a scheme for uniting the two houses by proposing the marriage of Matilda to Frederick, while he himself should divorce Hippolyta and marry Isabella. He really hung up on Isabella. When he broke his purpose to Frederick, that weak prince, who had been struck with the charms of Matilda, listened but too eagerly to the offer. But he wished to find the disposition of Hippolyta in the affair, and sought her apartments. He found them empty, and concluding that she was in her oratory, he passed on. On entering, he saw a person kneeling before the altar, not a woman, but one in a long woolen weed whose back was towards him.
"Reverend father, then,"
said Frederick, meaning to excuse his interruption,
"I sought the lady Hippolyta."
"Hippolyta,"
replied a hollow voice. Then the figure, turning slowly round, discovered to Frederick the fleshless jaws and empty sockets of a skeleton wrapped in a hermit's cowl.
"Aye, angels of grace, protect me!"
cried Frederick, recoiling.
"Deserve their protection,"
said the spectre.
"Remember the wood of Joppa."
"Art thou that holy hermit?"
asked Frederick, trembling. "What is thy errand to me?"
"Forget Matilda,"
said the apparition, and vanished. For some minutes Frederick remained motionless, his blood frozen in his veins, and then falling before the altar, he besought the intercession of every saint for pardon. On that night, Matilda, whose passion for Theodore had, if anything, increased, and who abhorred her father's purpose of marrying her off to Frederick, as Matilda had by chance met her lover as he was kneeling at the tomb of Alfonso in the great church. Manfred was told by the domestic that Theodore and some lady from the castle were in private conference at the tomb. Concluding in his jealousy that that lady was Isabella, Manfred hastened secretly to the church. The first sounds he could distinguish in the darkness were,
"Does it, alas, depend on me? Manfred will never permit our union."
"No, this shall prevent it! This shall prevent it!" cried the tyrant, plunging his dagger into the bosom of the woman that spoke.
"You inhuman monster!"
cried Theodore, rushing upon him.
"Stop! Stop!" cried Matilda. "It is my father."
Manfred, waking as from a trance, beat his breast and twisted his hands in his locks. Theodore's cry quickly drew some monks to his aid, among them Father Jerome.
"Now, you tyrant," said Jerome, "behold the completion of woe filled on thy impious head." "You cruel man," cried Matilda, "to aggravate the woes of a parent."
"Oh, Matilda,"
cried Manfred, "I took thee for Isabella. Oh, canst thou forgive the blindness of my rage?" "Oh, I can, and I do," answered Matilda, "and may heaven confirm it."
Matilda was carried back to the castle, and Hippolyta, when she saw the afflicted procession, ran weeping to her daughter, whose hands the agonized Theodore covered with 1,000 kisses.
"I would say something more,"
said Matilda, struggling.
"but it may not be. Isabella, Theodore, for my sake. Oh!"
And Matilda expired. A clap of thunder at that instant shook the castle to its foundations. The earth rocked, and the clank of more than mortal armor was heard behind the wall. The walls of the castle were thrown down with a mighty force, and the form of Alfonso, dilated to an immense magnitude, appeared in the center of the ruins.
"Behold in Theodore the true heir of Alfonso,"
said the vision. Having pronounced these words, accompanied by a clap of thunder, it descended solemnly towards heaven, where, the clouds parting asunder, the form of St. Nicholas was seen, and receiving Alfonso's shade, they were soon wrapped from mortal eyes in a blaze of glory. The beholders fell prostrate on their faces, acknowledging the divine will. Manfred at last spoke.
"My story has drawn down these judgments upon us all. Let my confession atone. Alfonso died by poison, a fictitious will declared by grandfather Ricardo his heir. Ricardo's crimes have been visited upon my head. Saint Nicholas promised him in a dream that his posterity should reign in Otranto until the rightful owner should be grown too large to inhabit the castle, and as long as male descendants of Ricardo should live to enjoy it. Alas, nor male nor female except myself remains of all that wretched race. How this young man can be Alfonso's heir, I know not, yet I do not doubt it. What remains is my part to declare," said Father Jerome. "When Alfonso was journeying to the Holy Land, he loved and wedded a fair Sicilian maid. Deeming this incongruous with his holy vow of arms, he concealed their nuptials. During his absence, his wife was delivered of a daughter, and straightway afterwards she heard of her lord's death in the Holy Land, Ricardo's succession. The daughter was married to me. My son, Theodore, has told me that he was captured and enslaved by corsairs, and on his release he found that my castle was burnt to the ground, and that I was retired into religious orders, but where no man could inform him. Destitute and friendless, Theodore wandered into this province, where he has supported himself by the labor of his hands."
On the next morning, Manfred signed his abdication of the principality, with the approbation of Hippolyta, and each took on them the habit of religion. Frederick offered his daughter to the new prince. But Theodore's grief was too fresh to admit the thought of another love. It was not until after frequent discourses with Isabella of his dear Matilda that he was persuaded he could know no happiness but in the society of one with whom he could forever indulge the melancholy that had taken possession of his soul. And thus Theodore takes over Otranto and marries Isabella as its rightful ruler, and they live happily ever after, never again troubled by giant disembodied appendages, though I do believe the grandfather's ghost makes another appearance the following summer when the twins are born.
See, happy ending. And there was stabbing and fighting and stuff too. So, the Castle of Otranto. Well, we're a little behind, but maybe we can catch up, huh?
Next up is Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. Also in the Gothic genre, more or less. More satire on Gothic, perhaps. This was Miss Austen's first completed novel, but it was the last of 2 novels published posthumously along with Persuasion. I earlier mentioned the poll write-in for Persuasion, and it made it very hard to resist presenting that one tonight. Yeah, but Gothic and complicated and happy ending won out. But I really must share the writing comments with you. This came from Daphne. Persuasion. We should read Persuasion because of the influence of stupid people ruining the lives and the love of 2 people with their meddling, gossiping, snobbishness, prejudice, bad manners, and their eager greed for money. See? I really, really want to go read Persuasion again right now. On to Northanger Abbey. 1803 by Jane Austen, published in 1817. Catherine Morland, by way of introduction here. Catherine Morland is one of 10 children of a country clergyman. Although a tomboy in her childhood, by the age of 17, she is in training to become a heroine. and is excessively fond of, obsessed with, reading Gothic novels, among which Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho was a favorite. See, how could I possibly resist sharing Catherine's story with you tonight? She's obsessed with Gothic novels. As our story begins, Catherine is visiting Bath with a pair of family friends. Now, lest we be confused with some strange cleanliness rituals, this is the city of Bath in Somerset, England. Now, while in Bath, the city, she meets two different families, the Thorpe family and the Tilney family. It's not permitted. Oh, there we go. It is permitted. You can catch that right there at that link if you'd like to read along with the story. And as before, the full text is available in the romance section of the Falling Water Library here in Kitely, and you can read and listen to music and dance the night away and cuddle with Captain Jack Sparrow if that's your thing. Northanger Abbey, Part 1, A Heroine in the Making. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy could have supposed her born to be a heroine. Her situation in life, the character of her father and her mother, her own person and disposition were all equally against her. Her father was a clergyman without being neglected or poor, and a very respectable man, though his name was Richard, and he had never been handsome. He had a considerable independence besides 2 good livings, and he was not in the least addicted to locking up his daughters. Her mother was a woman of useful plain sense, with a good temper, and what is more remarkable, with a good constitution. She had 3 sons before Catherine was born, and instead of dying and bringing the latter into the world as anybody might expect, she still lived on, lived to have 6 children more, to see them growing up around her and enjoy excellent health herself. Catherine, for many years of her life, was as plain as any member of her family. She had thin, awkward figure, sallow skin, without color, dark, lank hair, and strong features. Well, so much for her person, and not less propitious for heroism seemed her mind. She was fond of all boys' sports, and greatly preferred cricket, not merely to dolls, but to the more heroic enjoyments of infancy, nursing a dormouse, feeding a canary bird, or watering a rose bush. Indeed, Catherine had no taste for a garden, and if she gathered flowers at all, it was chiefly for the pleasure of mischief, at least so it was conjectured from her habit of always preferring those which she was strictly forbidden to take in. Ah, yes, such were Catherine's propensities. Her abilities were quite as extraordinary. She never could learn or understand anything before she was taught, and sometimes not even then, for she was often inattentive and occasionally stupid. Her mother wished her to learn music, and Catherine was sure she should like it, for she was fond of tinkling the keys of the old forlorn spinet. So at 8 years old, Catherine began. She learnt a year and could not bear it, and Mrs. Morland, who did not insist on her daughter's being accomplished in spite of incapacity or distaste, allowed her to leave off. The day which dismissed the music master was one of the happiest of Catherine's life. Her taste for drawing was not superior, though whenever she could obtain the outside of a letter from her mother or seize upon any other odd piece of paper, she did what she could in that way by drawing houses and trees, hens and chickens, all very much like one another. Writing and accounts Catherine was taught by her father, French by her mother. Her proficiency in either was not remarkable, and she shirked her lessons in both whenever she could. Yes, what a strange, unaccountable character! For with all these symptoms of profligacy at 10 years old, Catherine had neither a bad heart nor a bad temper, was seldom stubborn, scarcely ever quarrelsome, and very kind to the little ones with few interruptions of tyranny. She was noisy and wild. She hated confinement and cleanliness, and she loved nothing so well in the world as rolling down the green slope at the back of the house. Yes, such was Catherine Morland at 10 years old. At 15 years old, appearances were mending. She began to curl her hair and long for balls. Her complexion improved. Her features were often softened by plumpness and color. Her eyes gained more animation. Her figures more dances. Her figure more of consequence now. Her love of dirt gave way to an inclination for finery. She grew clean and she grew smart, and she had now the pleasure of sometimes hearing her father and mother remark on her personal improvement. From 15, indeed, to 17, Catherine was in training for a heroine. She read all such works as heroines must read to supply their memories with those quotations which are so serviceable and so soothing in the vicissitudes of their eventful lives.
So far her improvement was sufficient, and in many other points she came on exceedingly well, for though she could not write sonnets, she brought herself to read them, and though there seemed no chance of her throwing a whole party into raptures by a prelude on the pianoforte of her own composition, she could listen to other people's performances with very little fatigue. Catherine's greatest deficiency was in the pencil. She had no notion of drawing, not even enough to attempt a sketch of her lover's profile, that she might be detected in the design. There she fell miserably short of the true heroic height. At present she did not know her own poverty, for, well, Catherine had no lover to portray. There was not one lord in the neighbourhood, no, not even a baronet. There was not one family among their acquaintances who had reared and supported a boy accidentally found at their door. No, not one young man whose origin was unknown. Her father had no ward, the squire of the parish had no children. But when a young lady is to be a heroine, the perverseness of 40 surrounding families cannot prevent her. Something must and will happen to throw a hero in her way. Now, Mr. Allen, who owned the chief property about Fullerton, the village in Wiltshire where Mortland family lived, was ordered to Bath, the city, for the benefit of a gouty constitution, and his lady, a good-humoured woman, fond of Miss Morland, and probably aware that if adventures will not befall a young lady in her own village, then she must seek them abroad, invited Catherine to go with them, and Mr. and Mrs. Morland were all compliance, and Catherine all happiness. Part 2. The City of Bath. When the hour for departure drew nigh, the maternal anxiety of Mrs. Morland will be naturally supposed to have been most severe. But Mrs. Morland knew so little of lords and baronets that she entertained no notion of their general mischievousness, and was wholly unsuspicious of danger to her daughter from their machinations. Her cautions were confined to advising her daughter to wrap up well when she came home from the rooms at night, and to try to keep some account of the money she spent. Sally, or rather Sarah, must, from situation, be at this time the intimate friend and confidant of her sister. It is remarkable, however, that she neither insisted on Catherine's writing by every post, nor exacted a promise of transmitting the character of every new acquaintance, nor a detail of every interesting conversation that Bath, the city, might produce. Everything, indeed, relative to this important journey was done on the part of the Morlands with a strange degree of moderation and composure. Catherine's own father, instead of giving her an unlimited order on his banker, or even putting £100 bank bill into her hands, gave Catherine only 10 guineas and promised her more when she wanted it. The journey was performed with a suitable quietness and uneventful safety. They arrived at Bath and was soon settled in the comfortable lodgings on Pulteney Street. Mrs. Allen had not beauty, genius, accomplishment, or manner. The air of a gentlewoman, a great deal of quiet, inactive good temper, and a trifling turn of mind were all that could account for her being the choice of a sensible, intelligent man like Mr. Allen. In one respect, she was admirably fitted to introduce a young lady into public, being as fond of going everywhere and seeing everything herself as any young lady could be. Dress was her passion, and our heroine's entree into life could not take place till after 3 or 4 days had been spent in providing her chaperone with a dress of the newest fashion. Catherine, too, of course, made some purchases herself, and when all those matters were arranged, the important evening came which was to usher her into the upper rooms. Yes, but nothing happened that evening. Mrs. Allen knew nobody there, so Catherine was unable to dance. A day or two later, when they had made their appearance in the lower rooms, a fortune was more favourable to our heroine. The master of the ceremonies introduced her to a very gentleman-like young man as a partner. His name was Tilney. He was a clergyman. He seemed to be about 4 or 5 and 20, was rather tall, had a pleasing countenance, a very intelligent, lively eye, and if not quite handsome, was very near it. His address was good. He talked with fluency and spirit, and there was an archness and pleasantry in his manner which interested, though it was hardly understood by, Catherine. Catherine felt herself in high luck, and they parted, on the lady's side at least, with a strong inclination for continuing this acquaintance. But when Catherine hastened to the pump-room the next day, there was no Mr. Tilney to be seen. Instead, Mrs. Allen had the good fortune to meet an acquaintance at last in the person of Mrs. Thorpe, a former schoolfellow whom she had seen only once since their respective marriages. Their joy on this meeting was very great, as well it might be, since they had been contented to know nothing of each other for the last 15 years. Mrs. Thorpe had one great advantage as a talker over Mrs. Allen and a family of children. and when she had expatiated on the talents of her sons and the beauty of her daughters, Mrs. Allen had no similar information to give, no similar triumphs to press on the unwilling and unbelieving ear of her friend. She was forced, in fact, to sit and to appear to listen to all these maternal effusions and to be introduced, along with Catherine, to the 3 Miss Thorpes, who proved to be sisters of a young man who was the same college as Catherine's brother James. James, indeed, had actually spent the last week of Christmas vacation with the family near London. The progress of the friendship was thus entered into by Catherine and Isabella. The eldest of the Miss Thorpes, who was quick at its beginning, was warm, and they passed so rapidly through every gradation of increasing tenderness there was shortly no fresh proof of it to be given to their friends and themselves. Indeed, they called each other by their Christian name. They were always arm in arm when they walked. They pinned up each other's train for the dance, and they were not to be divided in the set. And if a rainy morning deprived them of their other enjoyments, they were still resolute in meeting in defiance of wet and dirt, and shut themselves up to read novels together. One day, after they had been talking of Udolpho and of other horrid books and of their favourite complexion of man, they met Catherine's brother James and Isabella's brother John in a gig. On introduction, the latter proved to be a smart young man of middle height, who, with a plain face and ungraceful form, seemed fearful of being too handsome unless he wore the dress of a groom, and too much like a gentleman unless he were easy where he ought to be civil, and impudent where he might be allowed to be easy. James, of course, was attached to Isabella. "She has so much good sense," he said, "and is so thoroughly unaffected and amiable." Now, at the dance in the upper rooms, which took place on the evening of the same day, Mr. Tilney made his reappearance and introduced his sister to Catherine. Miss Tilney had a good figure, a pretty face, and a very agreeable countenance. Her air, though it had not all the decided pretension, the resolute stylishness of Miss Thorpe's, had more real elegance, and her manners showed better sense and better breeding overall. She seemed capable of being young and attractive at a ball without wanting to fix the attention of every man near her. Chapter 3. Catherine Morland among her friends. Now, unfixed as Catherine's general notions were of what a man ought to be, she could not entirely repress a doubt of Mr. John Thorpe's being altogether completely agreeable. A tattler and a swaggerer, having elicited, as he thought, from Catherine that she was the destined heiress of Mr. Allen, he twice endeavoured to detach her by a glaring lie from keeping engagements with the Tilneys. And when he did succeed in persuading her to go with him in his gig, she found that the whole of his talk ended with himself and his own concerns. Ah, yes, he told her of horses which he had bought for a trifle and sold for incredible sums. He told her of racing matches in which his judgment had infallibly foretold the winner. He told her of shooting parties in which he had killed more birds, though without having one single good shot, than all his companions together. And he described to her some famous days spent with the foxhounds in which his foresight and skill in directing the dogs had repaired the mistakes of the most experienced huntsman, and in which the boldness of his riding, though it had never endangered his own life for a single moment, had been constantly leading others into difficulties which he calmly concluded had broken the necks of more than one person. As may be imagined, all this palaver rather wearied Catherine, not even his relating to her that Mr. Tilney's father, General Tilney, whom he was talking to one night at the theatre, had declared her the finest girl in Bath, the city, could reconcile her to the idea that Mr. John Thorpe had the faculty of giving universal pleasure. It was a visit which she paid to Miss Tilney to apologize for not keeping an engagement which Mr. John had caused her to break the first introduced her to the General. A handsome, stately, well-bred man with a temper that made him a martinet to his own children. He received her with a politeness and even a deference that delighted and surprised her. But whereas Catherine's simplicity of character made her growing attachment to Mr. Tilney obvious to that gentleman and to his sister, it was not so clear that he reciprocated her feelings. Generally, he amused himself by talking down to her or making fun of her in a good-natured way. One day they were speaking of Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and more particularly of the Mysteries of Udolpho. "As I have read all of Miss Radcliffe's works," said he, "and most of them with great pleasure." "Oh, I'm very glad to hear that indeed," replied Catherine, "and now I shall never be ashamed of liking Udolpho myself. But I really thought that young men despised novels amazingly."
"Yes, it is amazingly. It may well suggest amazement if they do, for they read nearly as many as women do," was Mr. Tilney's answer. "I myself have read hundreds and hundreds of novels, and do not imagine that you can cope with me in a knowledge of Julias and Louisas. Consider how many years I've had the start of you, girl. I entered my studies at Oxford. Well, you were probably a good little girl working your sampler at home.
Not very good, I'm afraid, but now, really, do you not think Udolpho the nicest book in the world?
Ha, ha, heh. The nicest, yes, yes. By which I suppose you mean the neatest. That must depend on the binding,
Oh, I am sure, cried Catherine hastily. I did not mean to say anything wrong, but it is a nice book, and why should I not call it so?
Yes, it's very true, said Henry. And this is a very nice day, isn't it? And we are all taking a very nice walk, aren't we? And you are two very nice young ladies. That was a very nice word indeed, for it does everything nice. Originally, perhaps, it was applied only to express neatness, propriety, delicacy, and refinement. People were nice in their dress, in their sentiments, or in their choices. But now every commendation on every subject is comprised in that one word, nice.
Meanwhile, Catherine was required to interest herself in her friend's love affairs. Isabella surprised her one day with the news that she was engaged to her brother James, and obviously under the impression that her lover was the heir of a wealthy man, she seemed to wonder whether his parents would acquiesce in the engagement. But despite her affection for James, she danced with Mr. Tilney's elder brother, Captain Tilney, at a ball which was given while her betrothed was absent on the necessary visit to his parents. And when letters were received from him, announcing their consent to the match and the agreement of Mr. Morland to resign a living of £400 to his son and to bequeath to him by will an estate of the same value, Isabella looked grave at first on the smallness of that income, and then at the fact that it would be nearly 3 years before James would be old enough to take even that. Meantime, she continued to flirt rather openly with Captain Tilney, much to James' uneasiness and to his sister's distress. But Catherine was to some extent reassured as to the captain's conduct by his brother Henry, and she was so overjoyed by receiving an invitation from General Tilney to pay a visit to Northanger Abbey. Remember Northanger Abbey? It's a story about Northanger Abbey. Northanger Abbey, his beautiful country seat, the departing interview with Isabella and James, at which he was in excellent spirits and she was most engagingly placid, left her blissfully convinced that the behavior of the lovers was a model of judicious affection. Bye, Lilla. I'm going to stick around. Sorry, guys. Part 4, Romance at Northanger Abbey. The Tilney party set out for the Abbey in great state. The ladies in general's chaises and four, with postilions and numerous outriders, and the general and Henry and latter's curricle. But as the first stage, the general proposed that Catherine should take his place at the curricle, that she might see as much of the country as possible. And for the rest of the journey she was tete-a-tete with Henry, who amused himself by rallying her upon the sliding panels, the ghastly tapestries, the funereal beds, the vaulted chambers, and the kindred uncanny apparatus which, judging from Catherine's favourite kind of fiction, she must be expecting to find at Northanger Abbey. Now, as a matter of fact, Northanger Abbey, though it comprised some parts of the old Abbey, turned out to be a building thoroughly modernized and improved. Notwithstanding, Catherine could not restrain her imagination from running a riot just a little. A large cedar chest, curiously inlaid and provided with silver handles, first attracted Catherine's attention, but this was soon found to contain merely a white cotton counterpane, a high old-fashioned ebony cabinet, which she noticed in her bedroom just before stepping into bed, struck Catherine as offering more promise of romantic interest. But even this, after a most thrilling search, in the midst of which her candle went out, yielded nothing better than an inventory of linen. Yet still, Catherine's passion for romance was not easily be disappointed. Hearing from Eleanor Tilney that her mother's fatal illness had been sudden and short and had taken place in her absence from home, Catherine's blood ran cold with the horrid suggestions that naturally sprang from these words. Could it be possible? Could Henry's father have... And yet, how many were the examples to justify even the blackest suspicions? And when Catherine saw him in the evening, while she worked with her friend, slowly pacing the drawing-room for an hour together in silent thoughtfulness with downcast eye and contracted brow, she felt secure from all possibility of wronging him. It was indeed the air and attitude of a Montoni. What could more plainly speak the gloomy workings of a mind not wholly dead to every sense of humanity and its fearful reviews of the past scenes of guilt? Full then of the idea that the general had ill-treated his wife, yea, killed her, ready even to believe that she might still be living and a prisoner, though, our heroine set out one day to explore a certain set of rooms into which the general, in showing her over the house, had not taken her. But Catherine was caught in the act by Henry Tilney, who revealed with customary openness what had been in her mind and received only a very gentle rebuke. Most grievously was Catherine humbled. Her folly, which now seemed even criminal, was all exposed to him, and he must surely despise her forever and ever. But Henry did nothing of the kind. His astonishing generosity and nobleness of conduct was such that the only difference he made in his behavior to her was to pay her somewhat more attention than usual. But the anxieties of common life began soon to succeed to the alarms of romance, and Catherine's desire of hearing from Isabella grew every day greater. For 9 successive mornings she wondered over the repetition of disappointment, and then on the 10th she got a letter, not from Isabella but from James, announcing the breaking off of the engagement by mutual consent. At first she was much upset by the news and burst into tears, but in the end she saw it in a more philosophic light, so that before long Henry was able to rally her on her former bosom friendship with Miss Thorpe without offending her. And when a day or two later a letter arrived from Isabella containing amazing sentences, "I am quite uneasy about your dear brother, not having heard from him since he went to Oxford, and am fearful of some misunderstanding. Your kind officers will set all right. He's the only man I ever did or ever could love, and I trust you will convince him of it." Catherine resolved, No. Whatever would happen, James should never hear Isabella's name mentioned by her again. And soon afterwards, a bolt fell from the blue. No, it was not a giant helmet. It was a bolt from the blue. General Tilney, who had paid Catherine the most embarrassing attention, suddenly and unexpectedly returned from town, where he had gone for a day or two on business, and packed Catherine off home immediately, with hardly an apology and scarcely a moment's notice. He had met young Thorpe in town, it seemed, and John had this time underestimated the wealth and consequence of the Morlands as much as he had overstated them before when he talked to the general in the theatre at Bath. The rudeness of the general, however, proved not so very great a disaster to Catherine. The interest and liking which Henry had first felt for her had gradually grown into a warmer feeling, and roused to a sense of this by his father's tyrannical behavior, he presented himself to Catherine at Fullerton, proposed to her, and was accepted. It was not long before the general gave his consent, getting at last to a right understanding of Mr. Morland's circumstances, which he found would allow Catherine to have £3,000, and delighted by the recent marriage of his daughter Eleanor to a viscount, he agreed to the union. And so Henry and Catherine were married within a 12-month from the first day of their meeting. Yes, another happy ending. I feel like I'm losing my edge here. But anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed these tales tonight, and we'll do 2 more next week.